If you still need an outline, come grab one. There's some left. There's some pens left. We're not having a fight club here, Tal. Okay. When I was at camp, we would actually have fight club in the cabins, and we would like board up all the windows and stuff so no one would find out. And it was safe. No one died, mostly. I did go up against someone who knew Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I held my own. I did not win, and I was mostly pinned to the ground the whole time, but neither of us tapped. So I call that a win. All right, you don't know. I'm old, Jameis, remember? Yeah, middle-aged. All right, I'm not middle-aged, nice try. All right, here's my question for you guys tonight, okay? We're wrapping up, we're coming to a close with our Fighting Fair series, but here's my question for you for tonight. Have you ever been in a situation where you're having a bit of a tough time and someone tries to say something really nice to you, something, to cheer you up, but it ends up coming out of more like a cliche that you'd like find sewn into one of those decorative pillows, like live, laugh, love, ha, ha, ha. They try to cheer you up, but it's all just a big cliche. Any of you? Just me? They're like, it'll be okay. The sun always rises, something like that, right? You've been in a tough situation, someone tries to cheer you up and they just say something like that. Maybe like, don't worry, it'll all work out. Everything happens for a reason. Every cloud has a silver lining. God will never give you more than you can handle. When God shuts a door, he opens a window. Have you heard that one? I've heard that one. Okay, yeah, right? So I know that when people say things like this, they're trying to be helpful, but these phrases aren't actually helpful because they aren't always 100% accurate, are they? For example, if you tell me that you're failing your history class or your math class, I might say, oh, don't worry, it'll all work out. But will it? There's probably no way for me to know. You might actually fail your history test or in your math test, and then I would look really dumb because I'm like, oh, you'll totally crush that. Well, if you didn't study, I'm probably going to fail it, right? The only way that these kinds of phrases are meaningful is if they're said by someone who actually has the ability to make those phrases true. And as much as I'd like to think that I've got everything under control, that I'm perfectly fine myself, that I'm able to handle everything, as much as I'd like to say that, there's no way that I can promise you that everything will be okay. That everything will work out in your math or your history class. I can't be like, yes, you are going to get an A+ in that math test that you've been fretting over. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about conflict and how to resolve conflict in healthy ways, respectful ways. And we started talking about how God is constantly working to repair our broken relationships with Him and how we can use this as an example to repair our broken relationships with other people. Then in the second week, we learned that we should do everything possible to live at peace with others. But both sides, if you're trying to work at peace with everyone, both sides of the conflict must want peace for it to actually truly work out. And not last week, we weren't here, but the week before that, we talked about what we should do when we need to confront another Christ follower when their words or their actions hurt us. And so if you've picked up on anything these last few weeks, it's probably that conflict is everywhere. And even if we have the best of intentions, things don't always work out the way we want them to. Has anyone had a friendship go sideways and you've lost touch with them over conflict? Don't name any names. I know I have. Things don't always work out, even if we've gone through all the steps and we try to mend it. The reality of living in a world filled with conflict can be overwhelming. It's really easy for us to get discouraged when relationships get messy. In fact, if you've been here for any of the 4 weeks, right, in this series, you might have already hopefully taken steps to overcome conflict and maybe try to strain a broken or strained relationship, try to fix it. And depending on how that's gone, you might have already realized that fixing what's broken is not always easy. It's not easy to do. And if that's the case, I wish I could tell you that everything was going to work out eventually, or that you should just look for the silver lining. Hearing things like that might be encouraging for a little, but it isn't going to get you any closer to making that broken relationship that you have whole again. It just won't. So what do we do when one or more of our relationships get wrecked by conflict and there doesn't seem to be any way to make things better? What if we try to make things better and we somehow actually make things worse? I know I've done that. I've had a conversation with someone. I'm like, I should not have said that. I blew up at them. I was trying not to, but I did it and made things worse. What if it feels like things are never going to just work out? Thankfully, even when we're fighting with our friends, even when our parents are mad at us, even when it feels like everyone is just out to get us, there is still hope. And I want to look at a passage in the book of John where Jesus has told his disciples that he will not be with them much longer because he's going to be arrested and crucified. So, as far as the disciples are concerned here, things are bad, and they're about to get worse. But let's read what Jesus had to say in John 16, verse 33. I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Okay, let's look at this verse, because on its own, it feels like that verse could maybe be a little cliche. When Jesus said, I've told you all this, like I said, he had just finished telling his disciples, telling his followers that he was leaving. But he also promised that they would get to see him again. And one day, they would see him again, and he would send the Holy Spirit to guide them. To say the very least, this verse leading up to the verses leading up to this verse are rough. They're hard to hear. But Jesus said, I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Right? Like, if I was one of the disciples, I think this might have been the point when I would have needed to ask a question. How many of you, if you pretend if you were one of the disciples, you'd probably be timid to ask a question, what do you mean, Jesus? I'd probably be a little timid. Jesus, you said that we'd have peace, but based on all the stuff you just said, things don't really seem so peaceful. And then Jesus kept going, and in my mind at least he made things even worse. He said, here on earth, you'll have many trials and sorrows. Again, that doesn't sound like a pep talk. If you've ever had a pep talk, right? I imagine myself in grade 11, I'm in football, right? And the coach comes out, comes into the locker room, he's giving us a pep talk, and he's like, you are going to get absolutely crushed. I'm like, what? No. That's not very encouraging. I want to win. I need to be hyped up right now. I know we're losing. Right? Doesn't sound like a pep talk. But then Jesus offers what could easily be mistaken for a cliche by saying, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Again, the conversation up to this point has been a bit of a bummer, but this last sentence carries more weight than any of the disciples, any of you realize. Here's what I mean. If I was standing there 2,000 years ago talking to the disciples and I told them, take heart. In that moment, that would have been entirely meaningless. Why? Because just like your grade in math or history class, I would have had virtually no ability to control the outcome whatsoever. But thankfully, I wasn't there. Guess who's there? Jesus. I wasn't there. And that's what makes all the difference. Just a minute ago, when we were talking about those cliche statements sewn into decorative pillows, we said the only way for those phrases, those statements, to be meaningful is if they're said by someone who actually has the ability to make them true. And when Jesus said that he would overcome the world, it's because he has. And so Jesus was telling the disciples that they could have peace and take heart. It was because they really could. No matter what was about to happen or how bad the conflict was going to be, the disciples knew that Jesus could be trusted. If Jesus' words can offer hope to the disciples, what about us? Even though our disciples even though our problems, our circumstances might not be the same as the disciples, I'm sure the disciples weren't trying to take a math or history test, right? Even though we have different circumstances, I think we can still find hope in Jesus' words today. I know we can. So let's see what we can take away from Jesus' conversation with his disciples. And the first is this. If you haven't heard this before, I'm telling you to you now. Life isn't always easy. If you've heard a pastor say, if you pray hard enough, if you do any of those things, it'll get better. Life isn't always easy. Cliches can make us feel better for a little while, but they really don't help us in the long run. In the same way, Jesus could have told his disciples that everything's just going to work out, just you wait, it's fine. But he didn't. Instead, he chose to tell them the truth when he said, here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. Not only is life going to get complicated, but it might even happen often. Some of you have gone through stuff that you shouldn't at your age, and I know I've gone through stuff that I wish I hadn't gone through. Life isn't easy all the time. He says that we can expect many trials and sorrows. And yeah, that word many isn't very comforting. That is not a good pep talk, yeah, it's going to be okay. Unfortunately, our relationships aren't immune either. Relationships are one of the greatest, most wonderfully amazing parts of life. That's why I love life groups. But they also have the potential to be one of the most frustrating, most discouraging, most agonizingly heartbreaking. There's a lot of life that we can't control, but instead of sugarcoating it, Jesus called it like it is. And thankfully, though, he didn't just stop there. He also let us know that Jesus has us covered. Jesus makes it very clear that our world is imperfect. And because our world's imperfect, life isn't always going to be easy. Still, Jesus also makes it very clear that he is the only one with the ability to overcome the world's brokenness. In the book of Colossians, the Apostle Paul describes Jesus' relationship to our world in this way. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. When Paul said that Jesus is supreme over all creation, he's basically saying that Jesus can do everything he wants to do. And in his conversation with his disciples, he gives us the assurance that he wants to offer peace to those who are hurting. So if you are in a situation that is full of conflict, or if you can't see a way to rebuild your strained and broken relationships, I want you to know that Jesus has you covered. He's the only one who can. And over, Scripture points to the reality that he cares about you more than anything else. One more thing that we can take away from Jesus' conversation with the disciples is this. God still works in hopeless situations. Even though Jesus had told his disciples that things were about to get difficult, things were going to get rough, they had no idea how bad it was going to be. Within a very short time of their conversation that Jesus is having with them, Jesus is actually arrested, he stood trial, and he's sentenced to death by crucifixion. shortly after that conversation. Even though Jesus was innocent and could have stopped things at any time, he pushed forward because he knew his death and his resurrection would change the trajectory of history forever. Let's back up a bit and look at the end of Jesus' time on the cross from Matthew 27, starting in verse 45. At noon, darkness fell across the whole earth, whole land, until 3 o'clock. About 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? These words show the situation's hopelessness. And they were some of Jesus' last words before he died. And in order to fully understand what Jesus meant when he said, but take heart, because I have overcome the world, we must first realize that when Jesus said this, he knew what was ahead. He knew what was coming. He knew that he would be arrested, he would be beaten. He knew that his disciples would betray him. He knew that he would be crucified, and he knew that he would die. But he also knew that an angel would announce to Mary and Mary Magdalene 3 days later. Then the angel spoke to the woman. Don't be afraid, he said. I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come, see where his body was lying. You see, Jesus knew that things would be made right, but he also knew what it would take to get there. Friends, I know that there are going to be times in your life where you feel absolutely hopeless. But I want you to know that hopeless situations also happen to be when God shows himself to be everything he's promised. In these moments, God shows himself to be the strongest, kindest, most loving. So if you ever find yourself in one of those moments, those hopeless situations, please know that you're not alone. That you're never alone. So then what can we do with what we've learned? How do we respond to this? I have a few ideas here. Some of you are in Bible quizzing, and you have verses that help you in situations where you're feeling hopeless. I'd encourage you to memorize some. When relationships seem hopeless and the hard times come, we can lean into the truth of Jesus' words in John 16:33. John 16:33. I want you guys to look that up. If you have a pen or paper, write it down, because I want you to look it up. John 16:33. Ooh. No. It's not John 3:16, no.